For lovers of books, these orgies of destruction in which libraries are perceived as helpless victims are tragic and senseless. Far less attention has been paid to the role of libraries as agents of conflict. Libraries and their collections could play a critical role in incubating the ideologies that have set creed against creed, nation against nation, even neighbor against neighbor. Hello, everyone. My name's Leslie. This is my channel, Books, Screws, and Purrs. I'm doing a short book review in honor of my readathon, which is 8 books on Louis de Pointe-du-Lac's bookshelf. You know already that I'm an obsessed fan of Interview with the Vampire. So it's just an Interview with the Vampire Inspired Readathon. And so I'm fulfilling the prompt, Louis loves books. So I'm a bit loosey-goosey with the prompts. So basically, read a book about reading, read a book about books, read a book about libraries, bookstores, that kind of thing. And so that quote was from chapter 19 of The Library of Fragile History. It's nonfiction. Actually, let me get my notes. It's nonfiction. It's the authors, there's 2 authors, Andrew Pettegree and Arthur I feel like I'm gonna mess up his last name, Weduwen. This was narrated by Sean Barrett because I basically like hybrid, read, listened to it, and mostly listened to it. And let me tell you, if I wasn't under a time crunch, I would have rather read the print more than the audio because the narrator was very clear, but was putting me to sleep. Was putting me into some restful nights. So just keep that in mind. I've rarely, this is probably like the second time I've ever had to put a audiobook on 2-point speed, and I definitely had to do that to read this. I was excited to read this because it's basically like the first time I'm reading a tome, and it's a little over 500 pages, I think. But so much of this book is references because it's a nonfiction work. So you can knock off like 100 pages. It's 414 pages altogether that you're actually reading. So just keep that in mind. I was a little disappointed because I was excited to read a tome and then realized most of it's just references. Or, a big chunk of it, I should say, is references, not most of it. So ultimately, this covers the history of libraries, but in order to discuss the topic of the history of libraries, we have to talk about the origins of scripts, like of books, which, start with scripts. And I think I found that the early on portion as the most, I guess you could say, like, entertaining, I suppose. Again, nonfiction, a very dry read. I'm really glad that I read this, but if I had the time, I would like to slow read this, which is actually what I intended to do, to just kind of slow read along everything else and keep this for like the last book in the 2-month readathon. But I just started to really get into this as I was listening to it in traffic on my way to work, and so it just kind of worked out that I'm getting this book done way before a whole bunch of other ones. And so, you know what, just my luck, here I am. I did kind of not want to go too deeply in this because it's supposed to be a short book review. So I'll just kind of mention some things that really stood out to me. In part 1, I think there are 5 parts to this book. It's called Inception and Survival. So we learn how script was on papyrus and was transferred to parchment in Christian monasteries. Wow, my writing is terrible. It was written, the copyrights were done by monks, and it takes teams of scribes to write a book. That just seemed like incredible. This is, if you really get into, if you have a deep love of books and stuff like that, you're going to find the construction and metamorphosis of books and libraries like really interesting. So this is my alley, even though this is really like dry. This is something that became disruptive to Italians. I was reading in chapter 2. I hope I'm not messing this up too much. On page 38, there's a discussion about the 18th century pam- oh, I always say this word wrong. Palimpsests. And I am going to be using this section probably for my development of my sprints for February. This will make sense if you haven't joined my sprints, because I'm basically writing a little bit like, this is like the closest thing you're going to get from me from fan fiction of where I'm writing why we are in Louis' library, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to page 36. And I'll just kind of read what stood out to me. So 8th century. Oh yeah, the period between the 6th and 8th century was a great age of the palimpsest, a parchment manuscript where the original text had been scraped or scraped or washed off in order to free up valuable writing material. The obliteration of classical text was not necessarily an act of hostility to the august literature of Rome. Many more Christian than pagan texts were destroyed in this manner. Parchment was so precious to carry on obsolete texts. I'm trying to think about some other things. Oh yeah, and I even read about like letters of gold. And then part 2 goes on to the crisis of print. And in the chapter 4, which is Infernal Press, they talk about how fast production then made books like a saturated market, which led to like a decrease in price. And I thought that was interesting because we're really early on getting a sense of like how supply and demand is making its mark. But I'm learning through the lens of like reading about books. You know, I'm not even at libraries yet, right? And so chapter 6 goes on to talk about the Reformation and how the boom of Protestants that were for, I think, Luther increased printers, but then, you know, that then bring on, should I even call that political? Like religious, or what is it called? Backlash. You know, people were getting burned, imprisoned, for having this information. So we're kind of seeing like the private library develop and what it was developed for, which is pretty incredible. Also, I forgot to say, this is my usual spot to record, and I'm using my little ring light, which I rarely use, and so you can see my glasses. So it's kind of annoying, but thank you for being, you know, putting up with this, because I usually record in the other room. I'm doing what I can. Let me see. Yeah, so we learn about how private libraries developed, and private libraries could even be in churches, right? And how people started to maybe like let someone borrow it, but it was mainly there's like this gatekeeping nature of it, because it would only be to other uh, religious figures that had access, right? And they're also, like I spoke about before, about oh, you know what? I'm going to talk about page 163, which is pretty interesting. I hope you don't mind me babbling, because there's too much going on in this book. Oh yeah, this stood out to me because I read a comic that talks about the 100 years of no, not 100 years. The 500 years of resistance, indigenous resistance, and talks about something very specific that is also talked about in here, and it's on page 163. It's called The Monks of War, and I'll just read like maybe a paragraph. Among the treasures laid out by Montezuma for his guests were a number of books. They were the first casualties of the conquest. The Spaniards recognized that they were in the presence of a sophisticated civilization. The Aztecs and the Mayans in particular could boast major achievements in the fields of mathematics and astronomy. Tenochtitlan, I'm going to say that wrong. Yeah. I know it in my head when I hear it on the audio. Tenochtitlan, now the site of Mexico City, was an architectural marvel and probably larger than any contemporary European city. The subjugation of such an advanced society required a systematic destruction of its books and archives, and partly to demoralize a potentially potent military foe. So, what I really like about when learning about the destruction of one's culture and like colonization and tactics of war, we're seeing it play out in the literary field, right? And it's not always framed that way. Like this particular part of history, I do know about because I've read briefly from the comic book, and there's also a couple of books I'm going to be reading later on the next couple of years covering the subject, and I'm just aware of this happening, and it's just interesting, like because it's not just the destruction of language which happens, but we're really seeing how the destruction of books was a way to destroy knowledge, and that whether it's script or sorry, I'm blocking the light. Whether it's script or language, it's a way to like destroy someone's culture, and we're getting a sense of just how important that is. Like oral tradition, written tradition, it's all important. And I just really appreciated that. And then we go on and read about the antiquarians at the mid 1800s, monasteries. Books were sold and distributed by friars in order to survive, right? Because there's so much shifting in their own lives that was going on, right? And then we're going to go on. I'm going to go to chapter 14. It would have helped if I wrote what page that was. Oh, I know it's right over here. Chapter 14, page 276, which is Building Empires. In Canada, subscription libraries were actively encouraged by the colonial administration and liberally funded. Montreal was served by 4 subscription libraries, the largest of which had a stock of 3,800 volumes. By 1858, there were 143 private library associations receiving aid from the government, mostly through funds to buy books from Britain. In Quebec and Montreal, the libraries were seen as a means to instill British values in otherwise entirely French regions, whereas in the gold fields of British Columbia, it was hoped that libraries could bring order, culture, and respectability to rougher frontier posts. So it's interesting that we've like learned how there's been a destruction of literature, in a way to create erasure, and to colonize. And in here, that same tactic is used, but then to like strengthen those that are actually, yeah, it's still part of the same like colonial construct, right? But it's like, hey, these people over here, we want to destroy them in any way possible, and these are the people that we want to educate. And it's just kind of those tactics keep coming up. And so what I enjoy is that we're learning about really early on about the private library system, the religious basis for it, how they're used to protest, and then from people having private libraries in their own homes that were policed, then over time we have these library subscriptions, right? So you could pay a certain amount to have access, because borrowing was not something that necessarily initially happened just for anyone. And so much of this requires funding. This is very much like a tumultuous existence for libraries. There's also not just book burning, library burning altogether. And my takeaway from this book is that the public library system as we know it today is something very recent, and it is fragile. The library system has always been fragile and continues to be fragile and requires public outcry and funding. And so I just really enjoyed everything that I learned in here. There's just a lot of informational gems. Let me see. I'm going back to my notes because I have everything everywhere, and I'm kind of concerned I deleted something. With that said, if you did read anything for this prompt, let me know what you read. If it's something different from what I'm reading, I would very much like to hear your thoughts. Also, I'm going to ask you this, but then I'll answer myself. When you read this book, what connections do you see to Louis de Pointe du Lac in your reading? Did you think about the character differently when reflecting on the different timelines that this character may have seen in their lifetime? For me, what I love about Louis is his love of reading. You know, whether he's okay. So when Claudia takes off that first time around, he's miserable and he's making Lestat miserable, and he's surrounding himself with books, and that's like a comfort to him. And it's not just in search of her, but it really is, seems to be like almost like a binky in a way. Also, previously to that, I think, no, after that, when Claudia comes back and Lestat drops him from the sky, drops Louis from the sky, Lestat does what Lestat does, which is his love language is buying stuff. So one of the gifts that he gives Louis is this like rare book, and the book is actually canon from the Vampire Chronicles. But that's kind of one of those little Easter eggs. But he clearly sees what Louis loves, which is books. Louis has access to a library. And to kind of go off on a tangent, there is this one line that Louis says to Lestat when they're arguing. Louis is just trying to be mean, and he says something like, "Oh," basically he's saying, like, to paraphrase, he says something like, "All you do is kind of like surface level reading. You kind of read a couple of pages and that's it, and try to pass yourself off as if you know what you're talking about." All right, but that's Louis' perspective. What I actually think is going on in that is that Lestat has that same power as Santiago does that we see in season 2, that which is that Lestat could read the book really quick, but he is constantly trying to not really show how many different powers he has, because he doesn't want Louis to be aware of like how much of a power imbalance, how much more of a power imbalance gap they have together. So I actually think that Louis is seeing him opening a book, reading it for a little bit, and then tossing it aside, when actually Lestat's read the entire book very quickly and is not telling Louis that. I think that's what's really going on there. Anyways, to go back to our subject about Louis' love of books, in season 2, we learned that, Louis is with Armand, and they go across all these different places in the world and check out museums. And you know what? Take Louis to a library. That's where he wants to be. And where Lestat always, not that he really needs Lestat's approval for this, but like Lestat knows what he likes and made sure he had books. But with Armand, as we see in modern day Dubai, Louis does not have quick access to books in their home. I mean, he could get a book himself if he wanted, but Armand has all the books on a bookshelf that's attached to the ceiling that Louis cannot apparently reach, because he doesn't necessarily have that same gift that Armand does, or Lestat. And so I just find that very telling. Kind of shows you who's really being open with him in some ways and who's trying to like hold him back. Anyways, I went on a whole tangent. But I definitely think that this would be a book that would be on Louis's bookshelf and that he would love it. He would be just as entertained about like the origins of the development of book over time as much as we are when we're reading this. So, all right, everyone, thank you for listening to my short book review and just my ramble because I have such great affection for Interview the Vampire. Let me know your thoughts. And I can't believe anybody is even remotely listening to anything that I have to say. And lastly, the next book the next book review is not going to be a short book review released on Wednesdays. It's going to be a buddy read live show scheduled for Saturday. So 3 days from when this book review comes out. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Make sure you mark that notification bell and whatnot. Thank you for being here, everyone, and just happy reading.